All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back to the Filipino and American Christian Convention 2021, our 20th Filipino and American Christian Convention. Fantastic. I'm really excited about all that has happened so far, and especially this special event we get to have here right now. We're going to have our guest speaker for tonight, Dr. Ed Stetzer, has made himself even extra available for us to do this time of interview. And he's going to be interviewed by our own Lance Hurley. And let me just share a little bit about both. First, about Lance. Lance grew up in a ministry family, and his father holding ministries in Illinois, Colorado, Nevada, California. The one in California, I followed his dad at preaching in National City a few years after his dad. But Lance graduated from Lincoln Christian University and with a preaching degree in 1981. He met his wife, Darla, there, and they've been married for 38 years and have 2 adult sons and 2 grandchildren, and a third is on the way. Lance began working with the Chicago District Evangelistic Association, the CDEA. When he first graduated, he was helping out a church plant in Manteno. It started there in 1981, 1 year after the church's birthday. Lance stayed and was involved with Manteno Church and also the CDEA his entire time, and became Bob Sloniger's part-time assistant, Bob Sloniger being the president of the CDEA. He continued to work there, and I'm going to bring us up to date to the present, because since 2001, CDEA, which was renamed Ignite Church Planting, has been helping and has started churches all over the Chicagoland area, more than 40, with a total Sunday attendance in these churches at 4,500 to date. So Lance lives in Bourbonnais with his wife, and we're so glad that he can come and join us this evening to interview our main speaker for this evening, Dr. Ed Stetzer, who is an author, a speaker, a researcher, pastor, church planter, and Christian missiologist. He's the executive director of the Billy Graham Ministries and distinguished chair of church mission evangelism at Wheaton College. He is the North American regional director for Lausanne International. He has been in the Philippines a couple of times and would have been there a third in 2020, but could not because of the pandemic. My understanding is he plans to go again yet soon. So I'm going to turn it over to our panel, to our interviewer, Mr. Lance Hurley, to our speaker, Dr. Ed Stetzer. Gentlemen.
Well, Ed, it is an honor to be here with you tonight. And
do they know we know each other?
We do know each other.
Yes, we're friends.
Yeah, we do know each other. So this is a great honor, and I thought we'd start with a question, just talking about you and your family. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family?
Yes, I am married to Donna, and we have been married this August 34 years, and we have 3 daughters. They are 23, 19, and 16. So that's both a statement of my family and a request for prayer.
Very good.
I have 3
and a full head
daughters.
Of hair. That's
true. That is true. Full head of hair as well. And my wife Donna, her favorite place in the whole world to visit is the Philippines.
Oh, very good. And why is that?
The people. She loves the people. So we went there, and we were there not last summer, because last summer nobody was anywhere.
Right.
But we were. Some before that, and we'll go back this next summer. We have a partnership at Wheaton College with Every Nation and Victory, and I preach at Victory Manila, and so we go there, and we went to they'll appreciate. You won't appreciate this. Boracay was closed, and so we went to Palawan. And so we went there, which they appreciate, and you have no idea what we're talking about.
Was it fun?
It's amazing. Is it not amazing? Yes, yes.
Okay.
It's the place to go in the Philippines. And so, my daughters are going off to college and graduate school in just a few weeks, and so very much love and going to miss them. So as they go off to college.
Very good.
Yeah.
But what do you enjoy doing for fun?
Being with my family.
Okay.
Is I don't really have like a hobby.
Okay.
Not that there's anything wrong with having hobbies, but my hobbies are often built around my daughters. And so my oldest daughter, Kristen, she loved to sing, so we'd sing.
Okay.
And my middle daughter loves animals, so we made a hobby of visiting animal shelters. Very strange, right?
Okay.
So, and youngest daughter has various hobbies and activities, but when you live a busy life, your hobbies are almost, and you have little kids, and kids are not little anymore, but they've all been home until August. One moves to California for college, one moves to Canada for graduate school.
Wow.
And so we're getting ready for those times. So then I'm going to get a hobby. Maybe I'll golf or something. I don't really know. So maybe I'll do that. I don't know.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit tonight, guys, about church planting and about some mission work and how the church can be effective reaching out. Ed, let's start with some of the church questions,
Yeah.
if that'd be okay. What trends are you noticing in the church, especially pandemic, coming out of the pandemic and so forth? Could you...
Yeah. So, and that's a pretty big question, and I don't mind a big question, but let me just give three big things that we're seeing trend-wise. One is, and we recognize we have people watching around the world, and some of you it's earlier in the morning, and some of you it's late at night. But let me say, in the U.S., we're at a different place than different contexts are. If you're in Manila, it's a very different conversation about COVID than if you're in Montana. Okay. So in the U.S., where we're gathering together again, where in most places there are no restrictions on churches, what we're finding is that not everyone's coming back. I think that was the big story, is that in the pandemic it seemed that in most churches, the front third of the church, those people who show up every week, right? I think in terms of a third, they got more involved, they gave more, they shared more, they served more. And that's one of the things that kept most of the churches afloat in North America. And in some places that hasn't been the case. It's been a financial collapse, but here in North America, the second third sort of held on. The middle third's kind of held on, and the back third's gone, and seemed to have completely disconnected. And in a typical church, the back third could be most of the church. I know that sounds strange, but the back third of the people who come every other month, but on a given Sunday, they might be a third of the church. They seem to have disconnected in a substantial way. So I think in the U.S. and Canada, and maybe in England and some places in Europe, this fall is an important time to regather people, and really, I think, an evangelistic opportunity. That's not the case. I just spoke in Korea a couple days ago. That's not the case in Korea. That's not the case in Manila, in the Philippines, and Mindanao. It's just different places depending upon where you are in the life cycle of the virus, the greatest global crisis of our lifetime.
So is that why it's not the same then?
Yeah. Largely because the U.S. rates, it's now largely the Surgeon General said yesterday, it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated here. Mm-hmm. So people are gathering. Tomorrow I'll preach here. We're in Chicagoland. I'll preach here in a church that people will gather together. They won't have masks. There'll be hundreds of people in the room. And that's not true in a lot of places right now. It's certainly not true in Australia. We'll have viewers in Australia. Sydney's on lockdown again. So a lot of it depends upon when you come out of it. Doesn't mean that gospel opportunities are not before us. They are. But that's what I call levels of engagement, disengagement. Also in the U.S., there's what I call the great sort going on. Okay. People are now wanting to go to churches that align with their ideology more than their theology. And it's a huge shift. We did a study it's called COVID Church Attendance Project. What we're finding is people say that 30% of the visitors that are coming to their church thus far are people who left their prior church because of disagreements over COVID. So it's a huge shift of people who are saying, maybe they're watching cable news 30 hours a week. They want to make sure that their church aligns with their cable news. And that's a new experience for most people, right? Maybe there was someone who tweeted something similar. It said, I know people who've left their church because of politics. I don't know anyone who's left their politics because of their church. And I think that what we're finding is that there is a sense that people want their church to reflect their ideology, not just their theology. So that's the great sort. And we've seen this in Chicagoland, right? Where we're saying people left my church because we required this or didn't require this, right? Or maybe I didn't mention something. Here in the U.S., significant news was made around the murder of George Floyd. If you mention that in church, some people left your church because of that. If you didn't mention that in church, some people left your church because of that. And so the great sort is going on around us. And lastly, we're in the midst of a cultural convulsion in the United States and North America and in much of the Western world. And every 60 years, it seems that the West goes through a cultural convulsion. The last one was in the 60s. Okay. And that cultural convulsion is making it harder to be a pastor than it's ever before. I know you've heard from pastors and church planners. For sure. I think that that's not going to end when the pandemic ends. I think we're in for 3 to 5 years of a very divided time. So we need reservoirs of resilience as pastors and church leaders to walk through that time. But I know I gave you like 3 things with subpoints, but that's a big question. And we're we're doing a lot of research about it. I think that the post-COVID church is not going to be the same as the pre-COVID church. And it's not so much because of attendance, though attendance is going to reset at a lower level, it appears. It's more to do with just the world is changing in stunning ways. In 2020 and 2021 will be marked as not just, it'll be in the history books. I tell my kids all the time, it drives them crazy. I say, you're going to tell your grandkids about 2020 and 21, and they all roll their eyes because, well, they don't roll. They're not allowed to roll their eyes, but they do it in their heads. But they are. But I think that cultural convulsion is going to last several years. It's going to be a hard time. It's going to be a hard time we're going to be walking through for the next few years.
What do you think? What should the church be doing during this time?
Well, I think that the church, in many ways, has stepped up, stood out, and stood in the gap in the midst of the pandemic. And I'm really thankful for that. Not all churches had. Some churches wanted to get themselves on the front page of the paper, and they did. But, my church is not far from where we are right now. And, like most churches, we had a little place to greet people. In our case, we're a larger church, so we had almost like a coffee bar area. And you go there now, and it's a food pantry, right? So we're serving the community. Our church, one of our campuses, is right next to one of the biggest refugee communities in the western suburbs. We have a lot of refugee resettlement in the western suburbs because of the presence of World Relief. And what we've just done is serve people. And I think a lot of churches have done that, which has given them a credibility, I think, to share the gospel with people as well. So there's great gospel opportunity in the midst of some pretty significant global pain.
Okay. Opportunities for the church.
Yeah. Well, tonight I'm going to talk from John 20. First, I'm going to talk about John 14:6. Okay. I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And I'm going to take us to the end of the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. So we're going to talk about how ultimately that's been that gospel work.
What's in it for me?
Yeah.
Jesus, that opportunity.
What's in for me is that peace that passes all understanding, that grace, but also the opportunity to say yes to Jesus, to join Jesus on mission. Are we doing that? We're doing fist bumps there.
Okay.
All right. By the way, there's like 6 cameras that we're looking at here. You guys are very technologically advanced here. I'm not sure which one to look at. Do I look at this one if I want to talk to the folks watching online? To those of you who are watching online, I'm looking right here. No one's telling me, so I'm just going to look right here.
And the reality is I'm just looking at Ed. So
yeah, there you go. There you go. Which is not a good thing for you, but anyway.
So let's talk a little church planting.
Yeah.
That'd be okay. So what opportunities are there? Because I lead church planting organization here in Chicago. And
yep.
What opportunities for planting among Filipino Americans do you see? Why might this be an opportune time?
Well, let's mention that neither you nor I are Filipino Americans. True. So we can say "Kumusta ka?" We can say a few words in Tagalog. That's kind of about it.
You're ahead of me on that.
There's no worries. But I think there's gospel opportunity in many different levels. One of the ways is the Filipino diaspora. Okay. The heroes of the nation who are around the world, and Filipino Americans actually, interestingly, are among the highest people who actually become citizens. They'll become citizens here, wherever country they may be. They have a high level of engaging in the citizenship that's there. But I think ultimately, planting among Filipino Americans is important, but also Filipino Americans being involved and engaged in church planting is essential as well. Okay. One of the things that Filipinos rightfully have a reputation for is being adept at crossing cultures. And so what an opportunity for church planting. We're here in Chicago. For those of you who notice the Chicago map, you've seen the Chicago map, flag a few times. And there are 4 red stars on the Chicago map. And there are 2 blue kind of bars. So the blue bars are actually representatives of two rivers that become significant in the history of Chicago. Chicago straddles the watershed. There's a certain place in Chicago where if you take a thing of water and you pour it out, that water ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. And if you go 100 feet the other direction and you pour the water out, that water ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. It's right at the corner of the watersheds. And when the city was founded, founders of the city said, this is going to change everything. They actually looked for this, it's actually called, you can go to the park today in Chicago, it's called Portage Park. Okay. But a portage is the place where you carry your canoe over here. So Portage Park is this kind of swampy park in Chicago, still to this day. But that's the point of connection. That's where the rivers were not far from one another, and it changed everything. So those two blue lines of the Chicago flag are representative of those two rivers, and the stars are representative of certain historic events. But I think those two rivers remind us of the fact that the reason Chicago even is a city is because this is the place that bridged the gap between the two water gaps. So this is the place where eventually you could take a boat. You have to get past Niagara Falls. So it's a little tricky. They built a canal around that. But you could take a boat and go all the way through and ship. And so Chicago becomes this great shipping point because it could bridge that gap. So every time you look at the Chicago map, you think about bridging that gap. Well, culturally, Filipinos have bridged gap across gap across gap. And adept in this, being able to engage in cultural context, I would say too, Filipino Americans can go to places and share the gospel places where you and I cannot. Okay. We see that not just in here in the U.S., but we see gospel work being done by heroes of the nation, Filipinos, part of the Filipino diaspora around the world in Muslim majority nations, right? We see it around the world in places where maybe you and I can never go. So I think ultimately the opportunity is great because of how God has blessed and gifted the Filipino people, and what an opportunity as the message goes around the world, as Filipinos go around the world. Little context, Heroes of the Nation is the idea of Filipino overseas workers who actually become a key part of that as well. They know that, but that's a different conversation for those who may be listening in. And so gospel opportunity, I think, abounds, and I'm deeply thankful. The reason Donna loves the Philippines more than anywhere else, the reason we'll return next summer and we go, we teach. We have a partnership, right? So they have a group of students doing their master's degree with us in the Philippines, and we meet there and do the classes in Manila, in actually what's called Fort Bonifacio, which they will actually say is not real Manila. It's fake Manila. So they know what I'm talking about, right? Okay? They know what I'm talking about. They know. But in doing so, we know that students from there are going in places that I can't mention on a camera, but they're going all around the world planting churches. And so what a gospel opportunity that's before us. And here as well in the U.S., but we also recognize that not all of you are here, right? Some of you are watching from different places around the world.
Now, I was at the FACC 4 years ago, I believe, and the consulate from the Philippines came.
Oh, so nice.
There are 80,000 Filipino people in Chicagoland and Illinois. Yep. So what cultural context, as a church planter, what do I need to be aware of if we want to start churches?
Well, again, we both would say we're not experts in this area and field. You're the experts in this area and this field, but we are talking about church planting. And so I think some of the cultural context to be aware of is that Filipinos, because they're often connect to the place they go, to the new homeland, that there's opportunity there, but also challenge there, right? Americans have a long history of asserting themselves over Filipinos. And that's something that, you lead church planting for the restoration movement in the Chicagoland area. We want to make sure that as we are engaged and involved in church planting, that we empower Filipino Americans to lead, to be those who are making the call, making the decisions, and more. But one of the things we know is that the importance of faith in the Filipino cultural context, which is different than much of Asia. It stands out specifically as a place and a people that are particularly engaged in faith. That's literally part of the reputation in Asia among Filipinos and here as well. So cultural context would include, How do we engage in intergenerational ministry? What does it look like when someone in first generation who may speak Tagalog or other languages, and that second generation that may speak only English? What does that look like? How do we maintain that cultural identity? Anytime you're church planting, there's first generation church planting, which tends to be somebody's among a language group, and then 1.5 generation is sort of the bridge. And then there's second generation, which is a whole other set of challenges. Third generation, and it just looks different in each context. Again, you and I are here because we're both church planters. We're church planting experts, but we're not Filipino American church planting experts. So I want to encourage that we would want to be, as you know, we would want to be listeners and learners. One of the reasons I came here early, right? I'm speaking tonight, but I said I want to come. I want to meet some people. I want to learn some things about the FACC, which is new to me. You've been here 4 years ago, right? I wasn't here 4 years ago, so I'm happy to be able to say I'm here to learn. I know church planting, written a couple books on church planting, but what a blessing to see Filipino Americans planting churches. And for those of you who are watching around the world, you're planting churches, engaging cross-cultural contexts. What a blessing it is to learn from you.
That's good stuff. What are some things we should avoid when it comes to planting churches?
Sure. I mean, one of the things we talked about a minute ago is you and I, as Anglos, we would say white or Anglo, whatever else it may be, is talking over, assuming that we know better. One of the things that we want to adopt is a humble, serving posture to Filipinos around the world, Filipino Americans who want to plant churches. Recognizing, for example, even among the Filipino people, there's a lot of diversity, right? So there's not, it's not like what we're used to, even in America. I mean, you go, if you haven't been in the Philippines. Right. So if you go to the Philippines, it's fascinating, the diversity and the history, and one of the things I love to do, I took a tour, and learned, and you learn about famous writers who literally are, that would not be ones that we're necessarily aware of, and how significant it is, and you learn about history that's there and more. So I think one of the things is to not assume that the right answer is just a mainstream in prevailing American culture, right? So that's the key as well. Also, when it comes to church planting, don't assume that everyone's going to be a convert necessarily. There are, the Philippines is disproportionately Catholic, and evangelicals like you, me, and most of the people watching, we might find that people are growing in their understanding of their faith, but sometimes they might come from a Christian tradition beforehand. It's helping people kind of make that distinct understanding. One of the things this is why Donna loves the Philippines, right? This is why I have a sabbatical coming up, and starting July 1st next year, because I'm going to be there in June of 2022, and my sabbatical starts July 1st, 2022, and I get a year sabbatical, and Donna's saying, why don't we just stay in the Philippines? You're going to be there already, just stay in the Philippines, right? Okay. But partly it's just the full engagement of culture. We do not have the full expression of familial relationships in as beautiful a way as the Filipino community does. And that's something, in every culture we look at, and there are things that God's already gifted or blessed a culture with. And so we see cultural values, right? Filipinos would report cultural values. This is not me examining, but they would report things like family, community, faith, loyalty, joy, adaptability, hard work. Those are things that come up when you survey the values of the culture as well. So I think ultimately we want to make sure that we avoid the to Americans, right? The Americanization of gospel witness, and instead we adopt a humble learning posture. So church planting you lead Ignite, and you come to our meeting, the Church Planting Leadership Fellowship, right? So I gather the heads of church planting for pretty much all the evangelical denominations in North America. And one of the things we look for is these church planters who are these strong entrepreneurs. Well, that can also be hyper individuality. And in a culture like a Filipino American culture, that's something we want to avoid. So avoiding things like that, avoiding assuming that people have no knowledge of Christian symbols or Christian background, and really avoiding the idea that church is primarily something that happens on Sunday morning. The rich diversity. When we were there, one of the great honors that we had is every night we'd come over, and you and I might think, I'm teaching a class, so we should go out to a restaurant afterwards. But just every night going into the home of a Filipino family and being welcomed and the hours-long celebration that it is such a beautiful thing. What do you think? Do we need to get him to the Philippines at some point? I think so. Yeah. So let's plan on inviting you out.
Maybe when you're on your sabbatical.
Yes. I don't know if I'm allowed to come home. But Mrs. Stetzer loves the Philippines. So
That's good, Ed. By the way, my dad started a Filipino church in Southern California.
Isn't that cool? Yeah.
Back many years ago. And
in San Diego. Some of you know the church. They said San Diego.
Telegram.
Yeah.
Then Mike and Eleanor, like you said, they were down in National City.
Yes.
It's fun. So how does an Anglo church, if I can go there, how would an Anglo church help reach the Filipino population?
Yeah. So almost always there's challenges and opportunities when you have a cross-cultural experience and operation like that. The most common way that an Anglo church is involved in church planting is by planting a Latino congregation. Okay, so just use it as an example, right? So, and there's great opportunity there, but also sometimes it can be in a paternalistic, like a dismissive sort of, well, you're our Spanish-speaking congregation. And we see that and we say we shouldn't do that. We know that we shouldn't be that way. Well, that's going to be true in any context, right? So if we're planting a congregation, if it's a first-generation Filipino congregation, depends upon the language of the group that's there, but you're going to want to avoid any paternalistic connection between the two. So, but at the same time, if the church can be blessed by the experience of engaging people in a Filipino cultural context, a Filipino-American cultural context, they'll actually learn from the community. They'll learn from God's people. Valuable things that will bless them. But what I would say is there's, ways to plant churches, recognizing its people orientation rather than task orientation. That's more the prevailing American culture is more task orientation. So we want to plant churches with a people orientation, right? It's often a tightly knit community that then seeks out other members of the community and builds the relationships that there. So the church planting opportunity, I think, is good. If the Anglo congregation, it doesn't have to be an Anglo congregation, I think that's the example you gave, but maintains a sense of humility, welcomes with open arms, one experiences the wonderful joy of the kind of familial relationships that would be just normative in a Filipino context, but less so in ours, right? Multi-generational family, multiple relationships across families, and really design in partnership with Filipino Americans. And again, we're asking these questions because we're here in the U.S., recognizing some of you are watching around the world, so you have to contextualize it to yourself. Design events and activities that would appeal to Filipino Americans, community events, right? Engaging community, engaging children and more, and multi-generational events. Those are all things that churches that report to us they've been effective in planting churches cross-culturally among Filipino Americans that they describe. Again, I'm sharing with you what we've kind of learned from other examples like that.
Okay. So I had a question about the percentage of unchurched.
Yeah.
So how is the percentage of unchurched Filipinos in America, or maybe
I don't know the exact numbers.
Okay.
Right.
But how's it compared to the percentage of unchurched
Anglos? It's lower. So Filipinos are unchurched at a lower level, or in other words, they're churched at a higher level, disproportionately Catholic. When you're here in the U.S., evangelicals have a higher percentage than in the Philippines, but there tends to be there's actually in the world there's like 3 or 4 nations that are disproportionately religious. The U.S. is one of them, Philippines is one of them, Ireland is another one of those among Christian traditions. So that's going to be particularly the case, predominantly Catholic, but not just Catholic. And like a lot of Central and South America, there's a transition going on from where evangelicalism is becoming more and more common, and evangelicals, particularly Pentecostals, and becoming more and more common. But again, still predominantly Catholic, but unchurched is less as a percentage, and particularly in the northern states where we are, it's going to be more. We're going to be more unchurched, less churched among the Anglo population, but the Filipino population tends to be more so.
Okay.
More churched.
What items of concern or interest do you think would you like to share with us, just on a broader topic?
I think we're in a really tricky time. In this context culturally, and most of our audience is going to be Filipino or Filipino American. You may not experience the full current that's going on right now, but some will. Some of you will be engaged in particularly churches primarily made up of Filipinos, Filipino Americans, Filipinos, wherever you may be. Some of you may be in churches that are more predominantly Anglo or something, or some other expression, predominantly African American in Chicagoland. We have a disproportionate, strong African American church population. Right now, evangelicalism, our movement, is kind of shaken. And I think that's shaking can draw us back to Jesus. And that's my hope and my prayer. But we need that. We need right now to be drawn back to Jesus. I spent all last week with a group of pastors I was teaching, and they were taking a class. We happened to be in Colorado, but we really spent a lot of time together. And you could hear and feel in them a disturbance that maybe we haven't seen before. And you've seen it. We've seen it in a lot of pastors and church leaders. Particularly as we come out of the pandemic here, hoping and assuming that the Delta variant doesn't lead to a fourth wave. As we come out of the pandemic here, I think you're going to see a significant number of pastors and leaders leave the ministry. Okay. You say, why don't they leave the ministry when it got really difficult? Maybe, when shut down or whatever. But the reason is pastors tend to rally, and they rally their people. And then at the end, they realize just how exhausted they are, and how one of the things too is the rising conflict in churches. I used to say, I wrote a book on church revitalization years ago, and I would say to people, if 5% of your church isn't mad at you, you're probably not doing anything. There's always somebody murmuring in the background. Okay. You're probably not leading if 5% of your church isn't at least some way dissatisfied with you. Well, today, it's 25, it's 30%. And if you followed the Illinois guidelines on the pandemic, there are people in your church who are mad at you, consider you a compromised coward. If you didn't follow the guidelines, or maybe you took off masks, there are people in your church who are mad at you because you've not cared for those with pre-existing conditions or comorbidities. So what happens is that we actually have a place where no matter what you do, you're walking through a greater season of conflict. And that has had a huge ramification. We actually started a partnership during the pandemic called Resilient Church Leadership. It's resilientchurchleadership.com. Every week we have a conversation about how pastors can build reservoirs of resilience to make it through this very difficult time. The meeting that I'm assuming you'll be at, our Church Planting Leadership Fellowship in August, is on helping pastors through difficult, conflicted times. We have Rick and Kay Warren will be sharing some of the psychological concerns. We'll have several leaders, and we'll talk about how do we walk through conflicted times. And some cultural contexts, I grew up in New York City, so right outside of New York City. So I'm actually grew up in a place that conflict is more normal and accepted. People actually raise their voices and argue with each other, and it's okay. But for a lot of people in ministry, that's not what they're accustomed to. That's not what they're used to, and all of a sudden they're finding this to be the case. So I would say that this is going to be a time when Christians are going to need to pull together. They're going to need the kind of family and the community values that we can learn from cultures like the Filipino American, Filipino cultural context. Because right now, a lot of church families are fractured in a way we haven't seen in a very long time. And we need one another. We need reservoirs of resilience. We need a peace that passes all understanding. Tonight, I'm going to talk some about that, specifically how we can respond to Jesus, right? Who says, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And even the theme of our conference, Jesus, what's in there for me? Well, what I'm going to talk about is the opportunity to say yes to Jesus on mission, but with that comes that peace. And we're going to need that peace right now in the midst of our journey.
Well, fantastic stuff, right? Phenomenal. So let's find out. What are you working on right now? What's in the pipeline for you, book-wise or whatever?
So right now I'm about 2 years overdue on a book that I'm supposed to have turned into university, and it's on the future of evangelicalism. Now I'm very glad I'm 2 years late, because I would have written a different book 2 years ago.
Right.
So right now, we're just trying to figure this out. And see, somebody the other day was saying, the church has been through this before. Maybe heard people say that, right? And I might have said that, right? We've been through pandemics before, but never in the history of the world have we been through a pandemic like this. This is not as bad as past pandemics, right? Think of the Black Death that swept through Europe, killed 60% of the population, but they didn't shut everything down. So during the Black Death, people, I mean, they knew that being near each other, they didn't know what a virus was, but being near each other caused sickness and death. But never before has the world stopped. And, the devastating consequences, I was talking to a pastor from Victory in the Philippines, and he said, too, that, their finances were just decimated. We know, we're Filipino Americans here, but many Filipinos watching around the world. And this pastor said to me, we don't get to print money like you print money in the United States, right? So it does have a difference. So the financial implications around the world, but the shutdown is just, we've never experienced anything like this in 2,000 years of church history. Now, again, please don't misunderstand. I was one person who wrote before the president shut down the country that churches in hotspots at that time, it all became a hotspot eventually, that churches should consider pausing their meeting for the sake of the vulnerable. Okay. And the reason I thought that was historically, churches, I mean, that's the only place people get together and expel large amounts of breath in this thing called singing. And 10 years ago, I guess it was 12 years ago now, my daughter came back from youth camp with swine flu, along with, I think, 4 other kids. And it made national news because at that point, they didn't know how bad swine flu was going to be. And they shut down our church and they shut down the schools. And the county was all over the news. So we knew what it would look like when something like this happens, right? And, I was the interim teaching pastor of a church here in Chicago called the Moody Church. Some people would know the Moody Church, but I was the interim there for about 4 years. And the Moody Church, during the Spanish flu epidemic, kept meeting. But it's been closed for over a year. It just opened this Easter. Now, again, closed is a harsh word because they were doing all kinds of ministry and connecting people online. See, that's one thing we didn't have before, right? So why didn't we shut down during the Spanish flu? And again, I'm not saying that was the bad decision. What I'm saying is, why didn't we shut down the Spanish flu? Partly because we didn't have an ability to see each other. Yeah. So, but then we can, Zoom and everything else, all of us carrying around iPads and iPhones, walking into each other because we're looking at our phones during the pandemic. So I think that we have to ask the question, what does the church look like and how is the mission best accomplished as we come out of something we've never experienced before? But I'm not discouraged. I would say, I'm perpetually encouraged, partly because I've read the end of the book and Jesus wins, right? I always know where this ends. Yeah. But I think ultimately that, again, we're the FACC, the Filipino American. I think this fall in America could be a great season of harvest. I'm actually the national spokesperson for the Back to Church Sunday, 3rd Sunday of September, because I think that the opportunity here is great for us to reach out to a community, to a world that's been battered and unsure, traumatized, not to gloss over any of that, but to show and share the love of Jesus in the midst of that. So I'm encouraged that if we say, and I'm going to talk about this tonight, if we say, "Here I am, Lord, send me," the opportunity is great.
Phenomenal, right? Phenomenal.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ed. Great job and great to be here with you. And wow, what a great encouraging word, right? And points us forward with hope. So, thank you, brother.
Thank you, brother. God bless you. All right, I think we're out. Back to you. Oh.
This is a thank you for your interview. You will be thanked greatly after you preach. Sorry.
Sorry, turn it back on. I just turned it off.
Okay.
There you go. Much better. Much better.
For the rest of the world that are interested in hearing me, you've turned to the wrong channel. But thank you for both of you to explain the situations that we're going through and the cultural problems that we have to face and how we can grow our churches, get it back on track, and to plant new churches. Thank you, and we will be thanking you again for your great message that we're anticipating later on.
Very good.
And thank you. This is a thank you from Filipino and American Christian Convention. It's a certificate of appreciation to Lance Hurley.
Thank you.
I'm going to read it briefly for your benevolent service and selfless dedication to the success of the 20th FACC, Filipino and American Christian Convention, on this July 15th through 18th, and it's given on July 18th. So that was signed, of course, by our president, Lynette Torres, and also by Cindy Jimenez, the chairman of the board. So thank you both. I love your ministries. I love your work. I hear him on the radio, and I enjoy every minute of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I so appreciated that. I really did not realize the history in Chicago, that the gap, right, between the two rivers, that Chicago has that history of being a place of standing in the gap. Isn't that appropriate for us, particularly for
All good.
got lost?
All good.
Particularly for those who are Filipino who cross gaps all the time. I really, their microphone might still be on. Yeah. But you can hear me. And folks, I know a lot of people are watching this from a lot of different places, but for us here to remember how Filipinos stand in the gap. Filipinos bridge gaps everywhere they go. And we know Filipinos are everywhere in the world, right? Every country you can run into a Filipino. It doesn't matter where. We know that's where because they bridge gaps so well. What an opportunity then for us to bridge the gap, to help bridge that gap for someone who doesn't believe, to get to know Jesus, our Lord and Savior. Gentlemen, thank you so much for that interview. We look forward to a worship time coming up in just about an hour.